The desert heat shimmered off the tarmac as Jake Morrison stepped down from the military transport. His duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a worn leather briefcase clutched in his other hand. Camp Pendleton's elite sniper school stretched before him like a concrete monument to military precision, low-slung buildings baking under the California sun, ranges extending into the distant hills, and everywhere the purposeful movement of men who killed for a living. Jake's civilian contractor badge felt like a neon sign advertising his outsider status, while the other new arrivals moved with the fluid confidence of career soldiers, their desert camouflage crisp and their bearing unmistakably military. Jake stood out in his khaki pants and polo shirt like a tourist who'd wandered into the wrong vacation. Well. The voice cut through the desert air like a rusty blade. Gunnery Sergeant Ricardo "Bulldog" Martinez emerged from the shade of the administration building, his weathered face split by a predatory grin that had intimidated recruits for 2 decades. At 52, Martinez was a legend in sniper circles, credited with over 40 confirmed kills across 3 deployments and known for his ability to break cocky soldiers down to their component parts. "What do we have here?" Jake straightened instinctively as Martinez approached, flanked by a pack of Marines who moved like wolves sensing wounded prey. Staff Sergeant Tommy "Ghost" Williams, pale and lean with eyes like winter ice, looked Jake up and down with obvious disdain. Corporal Mike "Diesel" Rodriguez, no relation to the gunny, despite the name, cracked his knuckles with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed other people's pain. "Corporate sent us a weekend warrior," Martinez announced to his audience, circling Jake slowly. "Tell me, Professor, you ever actually shot anything that wasn't made of paper?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a muzzle flash. Jake could feel 20 pairs of eyes boring into him, measuring him, finding him wanting. These men had earned their places here through blood and bullets, through midnight raids and dawn firefights. They'd crawled through mud and sand, taken lives and saved them, proven themselves in the crucible of combat. And here was Jake Morrison, civilian contractor, standing among them with soft hands and a college education. "I've done some hunting," Jake replied quietly, his voice steady despite the hostile attention. It was technically true, though he doubted. His weekend deer hunting with his grandfather would impress this crowd. "Some hunting," Ghost Williams repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "Boys, we got ourselves a real Daniel Boone here. Probably shoots rabbits with a .22 and calls himself a marksman." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, designed to cut deep. Jake felt his face flush but kept his expression neutral. He'd expected this, had prepared for it, even when the Department of Defense contract had come through, offering him a chance to apply his theoretical knowledge in a practical setting. He'd known it wouldn't be easy, but the money was too good to pass up, and after losing his university research position, he needed every opportunity he could get. "Equipment distribution in 5 minutes," Martinez barked, his moment of entertainment over. "Move your asses, ladies. Time to see what you're working with." The group moved toward the armory like a pack, Jake trailing behind as conversations flowed around him without including him. He caught fragments discussions of previous deployments, shared experiences in places with names like Fallujah and Helmand Province, the casual camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their lives. Jake had never been part of anything like that. His battles had been fought in lecture halls and academic journals, his victories measured in published papers and research grants rather than confirmed kills and successful missions. Inside armory, weapons lined the walls like instruments in a deadly orchestra. Rifles of every description, from standard military issue to custom precision instruments, worth more than most people's cars. The smell of gun oil and metal polish filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of cordite from the nearby ranges. "All right, listen up," Martinez called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Each of you gets assigned a rifle and scope combination. These are precision instruments, not toys. Treat them with respect, and they'll serve you well. Abuse them, and they'll make you look like the amateur you probably are." One by one, the Marines received their equipment sleek, modern rifles topped with state-of-the-art optics that cost more than Jake's car. Each scope was carefully calibrated, the glass crystal clear, the adjustment mechanism smooth and precise. Jake watched the process, noting the reverent way each man handled his assigned weapon, the immediate familiarity as they shouldered the rifles and peered through the scopes. When Jake's turn came, Martinez's grin returned with renewed malice. From beneath the counter, he produced a rifle that had clearly seen better days. The stock was scratched and worn, the barrel showing signs of heavy use. But it was the scope that made Jake's heart sink. A spider web of cracks ran across the objective lens, and one of the adjustment turrets was visibly bent. "Oops," Martinez said with theatrical innocence, his eyes twinkling with malicious joy. "Looks like this is the last one left." "Hope that's not a problem, Professor." The silence in the armory was deafening. Every eye was on Jake, waiting for his reaction, expecting him to protest, to demand better equipment, to reveal himself as the entitled civilian they all believed him to be. Ghost Williams was already smirking, anticipating the complaint that would mark Jake as a whiner from day one. Jake examined the sabotage scope carefully, turning it over in his hands, peering through the fractured lens. The damage was extensive, not just cosmetic, but fundamentally compromising to the instrument's function. Through the broken glass, the world appeared fragmented, distorted, nearly useless for precision work. But instead of protesting, instead of demanding replacement equipment or threatening to call his contract supervisor, Jake simply nodded once and slung the rifle over his shoulder. "This'll do fine," he said quietly, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised even him. The Marines exchanged glances, their planned humiliation suddenly feeling incomplete. They'd expected anger, frustration, maybe even tears. Instead, Jake Morrison walked out of the armory with his broken equipment and his dignity intact, leaving behind a room full of confused predators, wondering why their prey hadn't screamed. Dawn broke over Camp Pendleton like a gunshot, sharp and unforgiving. Jake Morrison stood in formation with 19 other candidates, the broken scope mounted on his rifle, catching the early morning light through its spider-webbed lens. Around him, Marines shifted restlessly, their equipment pristine and their confidence radiating like heat from desert sand. "Welcome to hell, gentlemen," Gunnery Sergeant Martinez announced, his voice carrying across the firing line with the authority of a man who'd sent bullets through human hearts. "For the next 2 weeks, we're going to separate the snipers from the wannabes. Some of you think you're hot shit because you can hit a target at 500 yards. Today, we find out who can perform when it matters." The first challenge materialized. As targets rose from concealed positions at 800 yards, silhouettes that flickered in and out of view behind desert scrub and rocky outcroppings. These weren't the static bullseyes of basic training. They were designed to simulate real combat conditions, appearing for mere seconds before vanishing again. 800 yards, moving targets, 30-second windows, Martinez barked. "Miss your window. Miss your chance." In the real world, hesitation gets you and your buddies killed. Staff Sergeant Williams went first, his movements fluid and practiced. The moment his target appeared, his rifle spoke with authority. Through the spotting scope, the instructors confirmed a clean hit center mass. Applause rippled through the group, not for Williams, but for the standard he'd set. One by one, the Marines demonstrated their skills. Corporal Rodriguez dropped his target with mechanical precision. Sergeant First Class Thompson, a veteran of 3 tours, made his shot. look effortless. Each success built the pressure, creating an atmosphere where failure meant more than just missing a target. It meant losing face among warriors. Jake watched and learned, noting wind patterns, observing how each shooter adjusted for the desert's shifting air currents. Through his fractured scope, the world appeared as a kaleidoscope of broken images. But his mind was already working, calculating angles and compensations that his equipment couldn't provide. "Morrison," Martinez's voice cracked like a whip. "You're up, Professor. Let's see what that fancy education bought you." Jake approached the firing line, aware of every eye upon him. The broken scope felt heavy in his hands, its damaged lens catching sunlight and throwing fractured rainbows across his vision. Through the spider-webbed glass, the 800-yard line was barely visible, a shimmering mirage in the desert heat. He settled into position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against his shoulder. The stock was worn smooth by countless hands, and despite its battered appearance, the weapon felt solid, reliable. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his grandfather's voice from decades past. "Boy, the rifle don't make the shot. The man makes the shot." His target appeared, a dark silhouette against the tan backdrop of desert hills. Through the broken scope, it looked like a shadow seen through shattered glass, fragmented and distorted. Jake's first instinct was to rush, to fire quickly before the target disappeared. Instead, he forced himself to breathe, to think, to calculate. The shot rang out across the desert, echoing off distant hills. For a moment, silence hung in the air like smoke. Then the spotter's voice crackled over the radio. "Miss, wide left?" "Approximately 2 feet." Snickers rippled through the group. Ghost Williams shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "Tough luck, college boy. Maybe stick to teaching." But Jake wasn't listening to the mockery. His mind was processing data wind. Speed, the scope's offset, the way the fractured lens had bent the light. When his second target appeared, he adjusted not just for distance and wind, but for the scope's inherent distortion. The second shot was closer, clipping the edge of the target's shoulder. Not a kill shot, but progress. The jeering quieted slightly, replaced by curious murmurs. "Getting warmer," Martinez called out, though his tone suggested he expected Jake's luck to run out soon. The third target rose from behind a cluster of desert sage, its silhouette wavering in the heat shimmer. Jake had been watching the mirage patterns, noting how they bent light and distorted images. Through his broken scope, he could barely make out the target's outline, but his calculations were becoming more precise with each shot. He squeezed the trigger with the gentle pressure his grandfather had taught him, following through completely, holding his sight picture until the bullet found its mark. "Hit!" The spotter's voice carried a note of surprise. "Center mass, clean kill." The silence that followed was different from before, not the expectant quiet of anticipated failure, but the stunned hush of the unexpected. Jake stood slowly, ejecting the spent brass and watching it glint in the morning sun as it fell to the sand. "Lucky shot," Martinez muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The day progressed with increasing difficulty. Targets appeared. At 1,200 yards, then 1,500, each distance adding new variables: more wind drift, greater bullet drop, increased margin for error. The Marines continued to perform admirably, their expensive optics and years of training serving them well. Jake's performance remained erratic but showed disturbing signs of improvement. His fourth shot at 1,200 yards was another miss, but closer than it should have been given his equipment. His sixth shot at 1,500 yards found the target's outer ring. Not a perfect shot, but far better than anyone expected from a man shooting through a broken scope. By midday, the initial mockery had evolved into something more complex. The Marines still viewed Jake as an outsider, but their dismissive laughter had been replaced by puzzled glances and whispered conversations. How was he hitting anything at all through that damaged optic? During the lunch break, Jake sat alone. Under a camouflage net, a notebook spread before him covered in calculations and diagrams. While the others cleaned their weapons and shared war stories, he was mapping wind patterns, calculating bullet trajectories, and documenting the precise nature of his scope's distortions. Ghost Williams approached, his pale eyes studying Jake with new interest. "What's all that math for, Professor?" Jake looked up from his notes, considering his answer carefully. "Just trying to understand the variables?" "Variables?" Williams laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's shooting, not rocket science. Point, aim, squeeze. That's it." "Maybe," Jake replied quietly, returning to his calculations. "But every shot is a physics problem. Gravity, wind resistance, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients. The bullet doesn't care about instinct or experience. It follows the laws of physics." Williams walked away, shaking his head, but Jake noticed he glanced back twice, his expression troubled. The afternoon brought the day's final challenge targets at maximum effective range for their weapons. Nearly 1,800 yards. At this distance, even perfect equipment pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Bullets took over 2 seconds to reach their targets, time enough for wind to push them off course, for gravity to pull them down, for a dozen variables to turn a perfect shot into a clean miss. The Marines approached this challenge with the respect it deserved. Even the most confident among them took extra time, checking and rechecking their calculations, reading wind flags at multiple distances, accounting for every factor they could control. Jake's turn came last, as if Martinez was saving the best. Entertainment for the end. By now, word had spread about the civilian with the broken scope, who was somehow hitting targets he had no business hitting. A small crowd had gathered instructors, support staff, even some Marines from other training companies who'd heard rumors of the impossible shots. Through his fractured scope, the 1,800-yard target was invisible, lost in heat shimmer and distance. But Jake had been watching the other shooters, noting how the wind affected their bullets, calculating the precise trajectory needed to bridge the gap between rifle and target. He settled into position, his breathing slow and controlled. The broken scope showed him nothing useful, but his mind held a three-dimensional map of the space between him and the target wind speeds at different altitudes, temperature gradients, the subtle curve of the Earth itself over such a distance. Shot broke clean, the rifle's recoil driving back into his shoulder as the bullet began its long journey through the desert air. For nearly 3 seconds, everyone waited, watching through spotting scopes as the bullet traced its invisible arc. Hit. The spotter's voice carried across the range like a thunderclap. "Outer ring, but it's a hit." The silence that followed was profound. Even Martinez stood speechless, his weathered face showing the first cracks in his confident dismissal of the civilian contractor. Around the firing line, Marines exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't luck anymore. This was something else entirely. That night, as Jake cleaned his battered rifle under the harsh fluorescent lights of the barracks, he could feel eyes watching him from every corner. The easy mockery of the morning had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and growing unease. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, longer distances, more complex scenarios. But tonight, Jake Morrison sat alone with his broken scope and his notebook full of calculations, quietly preparing for whatever test they would throw at him next. The weekend warrior was becoming something none of them had expected, a genuine threat to their assumptions about what made a sniper deadly. The third day dawned with an ominous stillness that made even the desert veterans uneasy. No wind stirred the sagebrush, no birds called from the distant hills, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on Camp Pendleton like a held breath. Jake Morrison stood with the other candidates at the edge of what the instructors called God's country, a vast expanse of desert that stretched to the horizon, broken only by rocky outcroppings and the occasional Joshua tree standing, sentinel against the pale sky. "Gentlemen," Gunnery Sergeant Martinez announced, his voice carrying an unusual gravity, "today you face the Hail Mary." A ripple of nervous energy passed through the group. Even the most seasoned Marines straightened at the mention of the legendary shot. The Hail Mary wasn't just another training exercise. It was Camp Pendleton folklore, a test that separated the merely excellent from the truly exceptional. 3 miles, Martinez continued, pointing toward a distant ridge that shimmered in the morning heat like a mirage. 5,280 yards of desert, wind, and physics working against you. The target sits on that ridge, and from here, it's smaller than a postage stamp held at arm's length. Jake squinted toward the distant ridge, his broken scope useless at such range. Even with perfect optics, the target would be barely visible. Through his fractured lens, the ridge was nothing more than a brown smudge against the horizon. Staff Sergeant Williams raised his hand. "Sir, what's the record for this shot?" Martinez's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "In 23 years of running this course, exactly 7 Marines have hit that target. The last one was Sergeant Major Collins in 2019, and he needed 4 attempts." He paused, letting the weight of those numbers sink in. "Most of you won't even come close. At 3 miles, a bullet drops over 400 feet. Wind drift can push it 30 feet off course. You're not just fighting distance. You're fighting the rotation of the Earth itself, the Coriolis effect." Jake had read about it in ballistics textbooks, but he'd never attempted to calculate it for a shot this extreme. At 3 miles, the Earth's rotation would actually curve the bullet's path, adding another variable to an already impossible equation. "The good news," Martinez continued with dark humor, "is that failure here doesn't wash you out of the program. This shot is considered more legend than practical training, but success." He let the word hang in the air like incense. "Success gets your name on a very short list of the best long-range shooters who ever lived." The candidates were led to an observation area equipped with high-powered spotting scopes and range-finding equipment. For the first time, Jake could actually see their target, a standard military silhouette mounted on the distant ridge, so small it looked like a toy soldier placed on a sandbox hill. "Jesus," whispered Corporal Rodriguez, peering through a spotting scope. "It's like trying to hit a dime with a rock." The first shooter was Sergeant Thompson, a veteran with 3 combat tours and a reputation for impossible shots. He spent nearly an hour checking wind conditions at multiple elevations, calculating atmospheric pressure, even consulting tide tables to account for gravitational variations. His shot, when it finally came, was magnificent in its precision and heartbreaking in its failure. The bullet struck the ridge face 20 feet below the target, close enough to shower it with rock fragments, but not close enough to count. "Damn fine shooting," Martinez called out, and he meant it. At 3 miles, coming within 20 feet was an achievement worthy of respect. One by one, the Marines took their turns. Each approach was different. Some relied on instinct and experience, others on meticulous calculation. Ghost Williams, pale and intense, spent 40 minutes reading wind patterns before sending his bullet into the desert floor 50 yards short. Corporal Diesel Rodriguez, built like a linebacker but surprisingly gentle with his rifle, managed to hit the ridge face just 10 feet from the target, earning a rare nod of approval from the instructor's dot. As the morning progressed, the failures mounted. Some shots went wide by hundreds of yards, victims of wind drift or miscalculation. Others fell short, defeated by gravity and distance. A few went high, sailing over the ridge into the empty desert beyond. Each miss was analyzed, discussed, and filed away as a lesson in the humbling reality of extreme-range shooting. By noon, 15 Marines had tried and failed. The desert heat was becoming oppressive, creating thermals that rose from the sand like invisible rivers, bending light and distorting calculations. The target seemed to dance in the heat shimmer, wavering like a mirage that might disappear at any moment. Jake had spent the morning in intense observation, his notebook filling with calculations that grew more complex with each failed attempt. He wasn't just watching the shooters, he was studying the environment itself, mapping wind patterns at different altitudes, noting how the heat shimmer affected visibility, calculating the precise trajectory needed to bridge the impossible gap. "Morrison!" Martinez's voice cut through the desert air like a blade. "You're up, Professor. Time to show us what that broken scope can do at 3 miles." The laughter that followed was different from the mockery of previous days, less cruel, more nervous. Jake's unexpected competence at shorter ranges had shaken their confidence in easy dismissal. Now, faced with a shot that challenged even the best among them, they weren't sure what to expect from the civilian with the fractured optics. Jake approached the firing line carrying more than just his rifle. His notebook was thick with calculations, his pockets filled with improvised instruments, a small weather station borrowed from the meteorology office, a compass for precise bearing calculations, even a smartphone app that measured atmospheric pressure. While the Marines had relied on experience and instinct, Jake was approaching the Hail Mary like the physics problem it truly was. "What's all that gear for?" Williams asked, his pale eyes studying Jake's preparations with growing unease. "At 3 miles, everything matters," Jake replied, setting up his weather station. "Temperature gradients, humidity levels, barometric pressure, they all affect boat trajectory. A 2-degree temperature difference can change the point of impact by several feet." He spent the next hour in methodical preparation that bordered on the obsessive. Using his weather instruments, he mapped the atmospheric conditions between his position and the target. With his compass and rangefinder, he calculated the precise bearing and elevation needed. His notebook filled with equations that accounted for everything from air density to the Coriolis effect. The Marines watched with growing fascination and unease. This wasn't how snipers were supposed to work. Snipers relied on training, instinct, and experience, not college-level physics and meteorological instruments. Yet Jake's systematic approach was undeniably thorough, accounting for variables that most shooters never even considered. Wind speed at ground level, 3.2 miles per hour from the southwest, Jake muttered, recording measurements. At 500 feet elevation, 8.7 miles per hour, shifting to west-southwest. Temperature gradient indicates thermal activity will peak in approximately 20 minutes. Martinez found himself drawn into Jake's calculations despite his skepticism. "What's all that math telling you, Professor?" Jake looked up from his notebook, his eyes holding a confidence that hadn't been there 3 days ago. "That this shot is possible, but the window is closing. The thermal activity is creating updrafts that will destabilize the bullet's flight path. I need to shoot within the next 15 minutes, or wait until evening when the thermals die down." 15 minutes? Williams scoffed. "You've been calculating for an hour already. What more do you need?" "Precision," Jake replied simply. "At 3 miles, being close isn't good enough. The margin for error is measured in inches, not feet." He returned to his calculations, cross-referencing wind measurements with ballistic tables, factoring in the Earth's rotation, even accounting for the slight gravitational variations caused by the Moon's position. It was the most complex shooting problem he'd ever attempted, requiring every piece of physics knowledge he'd accumulated over years of academic study. Finally, Jake set aside his notebook and approached his rifle. The broken scope caught the afternoon light, its spider-webbed lens fragmenting his view of the distant target into a kaleidoscope of broken images. Through the fractured glass, the 3-mile shot looked impossible, which, by any reasonable measure, it was. But Jake had moved beyond reasonable measures. His calculations had created a 3-dimensional map of the space between rifle and target, accounting for every variable that physics could predict. The broken scope was just another factor in the equation, its distortions measured and compensated. For through mathematical precision, he settled into position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against his shoulder. Around him, the desert had fallen silent, no wind, no conversation, just the oppressive quiet of 20 men holding their breath. Even the instructors had stopped their casual chatter, drawn into the tension of the moment. Through his fractured scope, Jake couldn't see the target, but his mind held its exact position, calculated to the inch. His breathing slowed to the rhythm his grandfather had taught him decades ago, each exhale releasing tension, each inhale bringing focus. The crosshairs, distorted by the broken lens, settled on empty air 3 miles away. Jake's finger found the trigger, applying pressure with the gentle consistency of falling snow. The rifle had become an extension of his will, a tool for translating mathematical theory into physical reality. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Jake held the shot rifle steady, breathing controlled, mind clear of everything except the physics of the impossible. Then, with the inevitability of gravity itself, the trigger broke. The rifle's report echoed across the desert like thunder, the sound rolling away toward distant hills. The bullet began its journey through 3 miles of air, following the precise trajectory that Jake's calculations had mapped. For 8 eternal seconds, it flew through space and time, carrying with it the hopes and doubts of everyone watching in the spotting scopes. The bullet was invisible, a tiny piece of metal moving faster than sound through the shimmering desert. Air. The target sat motionless on its distant ridge, waiting for a verdict that would either validate Jake's mathematical approach or confirm the Marines' belief that some things couldn't be reduced to equations. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant whisper of wind across sand. 20 men waited for the impossible, their eyes fixed on spotting scopes and their hearts hammering with anticipation. Then, cutting through the desert quiet like a blade, came the spotter's voice over the radio words that would change everything. Jake thought he knew about himself, and everything the Marines thought they knew about what made a sniper deadly. Asterisk the 8 seconds it took for Jake's bullet to travel 3 miles felt like 8 hours. In the spotting scopes, the distant target wavered in the heat shimmer like a mirage, impossibly small against the brown backdrop of the ridge. 20 men held their breath, their eyes straining through high-powered optics, waiting for a result that would either validate the impossible or confirm what they believed all along, that some shots simply couldn't be made. Jake remained motionless, behind his rifle, following through on the shot with mechanical precision. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't move until you see where it hits, boy. The shot ain't over till it's over." Through his fractured scope, he could see nothing useful, but his body maintained perfect position, rifle steady. Against his shoulder, breathing controlled and rhythmic, Staff Sergeant Williams was the first to speak, his voice tight with concentration as he peered through the primary spotting scope. "I've got Jesus. I can't tell. The heat shimmer is too bad. Target's dancing like a leaf in a hurricane." Gunnery Sergeant Martinez grabbed a second spotting scope, his weathered hands adjusting the focus with practiced efficiency. Come on, he muttered, scanning the distant ridge. Where the hell did it? The radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension like a knife. The voice belonged to Sergeant Major Collins, positioned on the target ridge with a high-powered scope of his own. Collins was a legend at Camp Pendleton, the last man to successfully make the Hail Mary shot. A sniper whose reputation was built on impossible achievements and unshakable calm. Spotting station to firing line, Collins's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Stand by for impact assessment. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the pulse of blood in his temples. Around him, Marines leaned into their spotting scopes with desperate intensity, as if sheer will could make the distant target more visible. "I see dust," Williams reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Something hit the ridge face, but "I can't make out." "Negative on the dust cloud," interrupted Corporal Rodriguez from a third spotting scope. "That's just thermal distortion. I'm not seeing any impact signature." Martinez's jaw tightened as he swept his scope across the target area. At 3 miles, even a near miss might be invisible through the heat shimmer and atmospheric distortion. The bullet could have passed within inches of the target and left no visible trace of its passage. Jake finally allowed himself to breathe, though he maintained his shooting position. His calculations had been precise, accounting for every variable he could measure or predict. But at 3 miles, there were factors beyond calculation: microclimates, thermal pockets, atmospheric anomalies that could deflect a bullet by feet, or even yards. The mathematics had been perfect, but mathematics was only as good as the data it was based on. "Firing line, this is spotting station," Collins's voice returned, carrying a strange note that made everyone lean closer to their radios. "I need a moment to verify what I'm seeing here." The words sent a chill through the assembled Marines. Collins wasn't a man given to uncertainty or dramatic pauses. If he needed time to verify something, it meant he was seeing something that challenged his considerable experience. Ghost Williams pulled back from his spotting scope, his pale face showing the strain of intense concentration. "What the hell does that mean? Either he hit it or he didn't." "At 3 miles, it's not always that simple," Martinez replied, though. His voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Sometimes the impact signature is so small you need multiple angles to confirm." Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. His calculations had been thorough, but 3 miles was an enormous distance for a rifle bullet. Even with perfect conditions, the margin for error was measured in inches. A slight miscalculation in wind speed, a small error in atmospheric pressure, even the Earth's rotation could have pushed his shot off target by feet. The radio crackled again, and Collins's voice returned with the measured cadence of a man delivering a verdict. "Firing line, I have visual confirmation of bullet impact. Stand by for assessment." The pause that followed felt eternal. Jake could hear the desert wind picking up, could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the dry heat. Around him, Marines shifted restlessly, their earlier confidence replaced by nervous energy. "Target assessment is as follows," Collins continued, his voice carrying across the desert with crystalline clarity. "Single bullet hole, center mass, approximately 2 inches from dead center." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have physical weight. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The words hung in the air like smoke from a muzzle flash, impossible to ignore but difficult to believe. Then Williams exploded from behind his spotting scope. "What? That's impossible. Let me see that target." Martinez was already reaching for his radio, his weathered face showing the first cracks in 20 years of unshakable composure. "Spotting station, confirm your assessment." "Did you say center? Mass?" "Affirmative," Collins replied, and now there was something like awe in his voice. "Clean entry hole, center mass, textbook placement. I'm looking at it through a 40-power scope from 50 yards away. There's no mistake." The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and chaotic. Marines crowded around spotting scopes, demanding to see for themselves. Instructors grabbed radios, calling for confirmation from multiple observation posts. The orderly discipline of the firing line dissolved into barely controlled pandemonium. Bullshit. Williams shouted, his pale face flushed with disbelief. Nobody makes that shot with a broken scope. Nobody. I want photographic confirmation, Martinez barked into his radio. Full documentation, multiple angles. This goes in the official record. Jake finally allowed himself to move, slowly rising from his shooting position and safing his rifle with mechanical precision. The broken scope caught the afternoon light, its spiderweb lens throwing fractured rainbows across his vision. Around him, the chaos continued, voices raised in disbelief, radios crackling with confirmation requests, the sound of grown men struggling to accept what they'd just witnessed. Corporal Rodriguez appeared at Jake's shoulder, his dark eyes wide, with something between respect and fear. "How?" he asked as simply. "How the hell did you do that?" Jake looked down at his notebook, pages filled with calculations and measurements, equations that had seemed theoretical just minutes ago. "Physics," he said quietly. "Just physics." "Physics, my ass," Williams snarled, pushing through the crowd. "You can't calculate luck, Professor. That was a fluke shot, and we all know it." But even as Williams spoke, his voice lacked conviction. The mathematics were undeniable. Jake had spent hours calculating every variable, accounting for factors that most shooters never even considered. The shot hadn't been luck. It had been the practical application of scientific principles to an extreme ballistics problem. Martinez approached, his radio still crackling with confirmations from the target ridge. "Collins is sending photos," he announced, his voice carefully. "Neutral, multiple angles, high resolution. We'll have visual confirmation within the hour." The crowd began to disperse, Marines drifting away in small groups, their conversations hushed and intense. Some cast glances back at Jake, their expressions ranging from grudging respect to outright suspicion. The easy dismissal of the civilian contractor was no longer possible, not after a shot that only 6 other men in the history of Camp Pendleton had ever made. Jake packed his equipment methodically, his movements calm despite the chaos around him. The broken scope went into its case, the fractured lens still catching light like a prism. His notebook, filled with the calculations that had made the impossible possible, disappeared into his gear-bag dot as the afternoon sun began its descent. Toward the western hills, Jake Morrison stood alone on the firing line, looking out across 3 miles of desert toward a target he'd hit with mathematical precision. The shot had changed everything, not just how the Marines saw him, but how he saw himself. For the first time since losing his university position, since watching his academic career crumble under budget cuts and departmental politics, Jake felt like he'd found something worth doing. The marriage of theoretical knowledge and practical application, the translation of mathematical concepts into physical reality. It was everything he'd hoped research would be, but had never quite achieved in the sterile environment of academia. The radio crackled one final time, Collins's voice carrying across the desert with the weight of official confirmation. "Firing line photographic documentation complete. Shot placement confirmed. Center mass, 2.1 inches from geometric center. Outstanding marksmanship." Jake smiled, a quiet expression of satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with proving something right. Mathematics worked. Physics was reliable. And sometimes, when you understood the variables well enough, the impossible became inevitable. The broken scope had taught him to see without relying on equipment. The calculations had taught him to think beyond instinct. And the shot, that perfect, impossible shot, had taught him that knowledge and precision could overcome any obstacle, even the doubts of men who killed for a living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his unconventional methods. But tonight, Jake Morrison was the man who'd hit a target 3 miles away with a broken scope and a notebook full of equations. And that was enough. Asterisk, The photograph arrived at 1647 hours, transmitted from the target ridge to the base communications center and printed on high-resolution paper that left no room for doubt. Jake Morrison's bullet hole sat dead center in the military silhouette, a perfect circle punched through steel at a distance that challenged the very limits of rifle marksmanship. The image passed from hand to hand through the assembled Marines. Like a religious artifact, each man studying it with the intensity of scholars examining ancient scripture. Staff Sergeant Williams held the photograph up to the desert light, searching for some flaw, some indication of digital manipulation or optical illusion. His pale hands trembled slightly as he examined the evidence of what his eyes had refused to believe. "This is impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. The mathematics were undeniable, the photographic evidence irrefutable. Word of the shot spread through Camp Pendleton with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. Within an hour, Marines from other training companies had gathered at the sniper school, drawn by rumors that seemed too extraordinary to believe. A civilian contractor had made the Hail Mary shot not just hit the target, but centered it with precision that would have been impressive at 500 yards, let alone 3 miles. By evening, the crowd had grown to include officers from multiple branches of service. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's senior marksmanship instructor, arrived with a team of ballistics experts and range safety officers. Major General Robert Chun, visiting from Quantico, postponed his departure to witness what his aide described as a fundamental challenge to conventional sniper doctrine. Jake found himself at the center of a storm he'd never anticipated. The quiet civilian contractor who'd arrived 3 days ago with a broken scope and a notebook full of equations had become something approaching a legend. Marines who'd mocked him openly now spoke his name with hushed respect. Instructors who dismissed his mathematical approach were requesting copies of his calculations. "Explain it to me," Colonel Hayes demanded, her sharp eyes studying Jake with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "How does a man with no military training, using damaged equipment, outshoot Marines who've been doing this for decades?" Jake sat in the base conference room, his notebook open before him, surrounded by officers whose combined combat experience spanned multiple wars and countless operations. The broken scope lay on the table like evidence in a court-martial, its fractured lens catching fluorescent light and throwing prismatic patterns across the polished wood. "It's not magic," Jake began, his voice steady despite the weight of attention focused on him. "It's applied physics. Every bullet follows the same laws: gravity, air resistance, the Coriolis effect. The difference is in how precisely you can calculate and compensate for those variables." He opened his notebook to the pages of calculations that had preceded the impossible shot. The margins were filled with equations, wind measurements, atmospheric data, and ballistic coefficients that read like a graduate-level physics textbook. Traditional sniper training relies heavily on experience and instinct. Jake continued, aware that his words were challenging decades of military doctrine. Shooters learn to feel the wind, to estimate range by eye, to compensate for environmental factors through trial and error. It's effective at normal ranges, but at extreme distances, intuition isn't precise enough. Major General Chun leaned forward, his weathered face showing genuine interest. "You're suggesting that mathematical calculation is superior to combat experience?" "I'm suggesting they're complementary," Jake replied carefully. "Experience provides the foundation, but mathematics provides the precision. At 3 miles, a 1-degree error in wind calculation translates to a 30-foot miss. Human intuition simply isn't accurate enough to work within those tolerances." Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, who'd been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke. "What about the broken scope? How do you explain hitting anything through that spiderweb of cracks?" Jake picked up the damaged optic, turning it over in his hands. The scope's distortion was consistent and measurable. I spent hours mapping how the fractured lens bent light, calculating the precise offset it created. Once I understood the distortion pattern, I could compensate for it mathematically. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jake hadn't overcome his equipment's limitations through luck or exceptional skill. He turned them into just another variable in a complex equation. The broken scope that was meant to humiliate him had become a tool for demonstrating the power of scientific methodology applied to practical problems. Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with our fellow officers. A silent communication that spoke of paradigm shifts and institutional change. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "how would you feel about developing a curriculum that incorporates your mathematical approach into our standard sniper training?" The offer hung in the air like smoke from a muzzle flash. Jake had come to camp Pendleton as a desperate civilian contractor, taking whatever work he could find after losing his academic position. Now he was being offered the chance to revolutionize military marksmanship training, to bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application that had frustrated him throughout his academic career. "I'd be honored," Jake replied, and meant it. The weeks that followed transformed both Jake and the sniper school. His mathematical marksmanship program began as an experimental course for volunteer Marines, but word of its effectiveness spread quickly through the military community. Students who'd struggled with long-range shooting suddenly found themselves hitting targets that had previously been beyond their capabilities. The broken scope found a place of honor in the base museum, mounted in a display case with a placard that read, "Sometimes the best tool is the one that forces you to think." Visitors often paused before the exhibit, studying the spider-webbed lens and trying to imagine the precision required to hit a target. 3 miles away through such damaged optics. Staff Sergeant Williams was among Jake's first students, his initial resistance gradually giving way to grudging respect and eventually genuine enthusiasm. "I spent 15 years learning to feel the wind," he admitted during one training session. "But your calculations show me exactly how much that feeling is worth in feet and inches. It's like having X-ray vision for ballistics." The transformation wasn't limited to the Marines. Jake discovered that teaching practical applications of physics was far more satisfying than publishing theoretical papers that few people read and fewer understood. His students weren't interested in academic credentials or peer review. They wanted knowledge that worked, that could be applied in the real world to solve real problems. Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, who'd orchestrated the broken scope prank with such malicious glee, became one of Jake's strongest advocates. "I've been training snipers for 20 years, he told a visiting delegation from the Pentagon. "I thought I knew everything there was to know about long-range shooting. Morrison showed me I was still in kindergarten." The program's success attracted attention from beyond Camp Pendleton. Military academies requested guest lectures. Defense contractors sought consultations on rifle and optic design. Foreign military delegations arrived to observe training sessions and request copies of Jake's curriculum. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jake himself. The quiet academic who'd arrived with a broken scope and a notebook full of equations had found his calling in the marriage of theory and practice. His students didn't just learn to shoot more accurately. They learned to think more precisely, to approach complex problems with scientific methodology, to trust in the reliability of mathematical truth. 6 months after the impossible shot, Jake stood on the same firing line where he'd first faced the mockery of seasoned Marines. This time, he wasn't alone. A dozen students surrounded him, their notebooks filled with calculations, their rifles equipped with scopes that worked perfectly, but were supplemented by mathematical precision that made them devastatingly effective. The target sat 3 miles away, the same impossible distance that had challenged shooters for decades. But now it was no longer impossible. It was simply another physics problem waiting to be solved. "Remember," Jake told his students, his voice carrying across the desert with the authority of proven success, "the rifle doesn't make the shot. The scope doesn't make the shot. The mathematics make the shot. Everything else is just equipment." One by one, his students took their positions, their movements confident and precise. They'd learned to see beyond their scopes, to calculate beyond their instincts, to trust in the reliability of scientific principles applied to practical problems. The first shot rang out across the desert, followed by the spotter's confirmation. Hit, center mass. The second shot followed, then the third, each bullet finding its mark with mathematical precision. What had once been the domain of legends was becoming routine, the impossible made inevitable through the application of knowledge and calculation. Jake smiled as he watched his students succeed, their achievements validating everything he believed about the power of scientific methodology. The broken scope had been intended as a cruel joke, a way to humiliate the outsider and confirm the superiority of military experience over civilian education. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a revolution in military marksmanship, proof that sometimes the greatest obstacles become the most valuable teachers. The man they'd tried to break had broken their assumptions instead, showing them that precision and knowledge could overcome any limitation, any prejudice, any distance. Desert wind picked up, carrying the sound of successful shots across the vast expanse of sand and sage. In the distance, targets fell to bullets guided by mathematics and launched by men who'd learned to see beyond their equipment, to calculate beyond their experience, to achieve the impossible through the simple application of scientific truth. Jake Morrison had found his place in the world, and the world of military marksmanship would never be the same.